Welcome to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast. Each week, we'll be joined by educational experts from across the globe, offering exclusive insights, inspiration, and guidance to help practitioners unlock the potential for learning in the early years. Throughout today's episode, we'll be focusing on the voice of the children. How can practitioners learn and adapt their practice based on children's own knowledge and language? Sharon.
Essentially, it's through this approach and context of listening. Children, and it's through their play. If we truly tune into, so it's about tuning in, and practitioners will understand the context of observation. And here, observation becomes even more key, because as children are playing, they become deeply involved. Because what they're doing is they're taking context that they already know, perhaps about themselves, and they combine them in new ways of knowing as they explore with each other. So where we have an understanding through knowledge and understanding, if you want to liken it to the earliest foundation stage, that knowledge and understanding, they're deepening that understanding with each other, and they're doing it in this approach of play. And what they're doing essentially in terms of voice is sharing a narrative. And so you'll probably observe that as being quite argumentative. And it's here that hierarchies in play exist. For practitioners, I know they'll understand those dominant characters, those key actors in play that may have a stronger voice. And it's these stronger voices that dominate in play that lessen children's confidence from diverse backgrounds, because these children do not have a narrative to be able to share their context about their identity. They don't perhaps have the words to be able to express. And there are ways of doing that, but we're really looking at what I call participation, participatory processes to support children to have voice, to build confidence, to build their own confidence around how they understand context and words and language that is used in the home environment, but then how they can share that in the schooling environment. Because let's not forget that a culture exists, the culture of the classroom exists, and children are very aware that they need to adapt to that culture within the classroom. They know that, and so they're working really hard to conform. They're doing conformity, and that's not what we're looking for here when we talk about giving voice. We're looking at enabling children to share their own perspectives because they're coming from a position of being confident. So giving voice and promoting voice is really about developing your approaches for listening, but also responding.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we talk about listening and voice, are we simply talking about the child's spoken word and language?
No, that's the starting point. The starting point is the confident learner will be able to express their views, and they'll express it in ways of colour, usually skin colour difference, hair differences, eye colour. Yeah, they'll talk about it in those forms. But what I'd like practitioners to be really attuned to are the non-verbal cues, the non-verbal behaviours where children become silenced and they become quiet, and they almost go into a mute, selective mutism, particularly if it's not the first language for the child, if English is not the first language. So practitioners really need to be observant of the behaviours. And when I've been in practice, I can see those behaviours where children will lay down, physically lay down on the floor and roll themselves, or face down, or they'll walk away from the play as well. It can also be observed in what could be described as disruptive behaviour, but that's not what's going on. The child is trying to find a form of expression, And so instead of going into a behaviour management strategy appropriate to that setting, try and establish why. So for me, it's looking at those critical incidents, is what I call them in my research, that are predominated by non-verbal cues.
Yeah, absolutely. Even when children don't speak, they always have something to say. And that's something that I always try to hold on to, or try to hold on to within my practice as a practitioner.
I do.
There is that tension, though, sometimes between observation and listening and allowing children to work out the conflicts within their play and intervention on the behalf of the practitioner. There's that real tension that often practitioners feel about when to step in and when that appropriate moment might be. What are your comments and thoughts on that?
My thoughts on that is, yes, you're absolutely right. It is very challenging because we should be allowing children to sort things out for themselves, to manage conflict. I think for me, where the shift comes is if a child is mirroring what we understand as quite prejudicial conversations or prejudicial thoughts that don't sit quite right in today's thinking. That's the moment where the knowledgeable adult is needed. That's where we go straight back to that Vygotskian thinking of interaction and the need for the adult expert to scaffold that understanding for the child, to readdress those barriers to participation. So that's where I think that there is a need. You're absolutely right, Shaddai, that the practitioner should, in essence, allow the children to. Conflict management is key, isn't it? But there are moments that, and I do say it, if you see it, you call it. So we can no longer make a stance for unconscious bias. We can't allow that, because the children are our future. This understanding and this knowledge and appreciation of difference and each other. I'd love there to be a day when we're not talking about looking at difference, but where children see themselves, and children are very good at this critical period between 3 and 5 years old before they go into much more formalised structures. My research shows me that children are really, and if they're given the appropriate resources to do that, then children are really adept at discussing and switching between identities. We do have to think about children that have mixed identities here. So they do need that knowledgeable other, is what I call the adult expert. And that's why it's key to keep developing your knowledge, to ask those questions so that you can, where there are moments of conflict, particularly around inclusion. I'm not talking here about sharing and the conflicts that we see children having to navigate within practice, but I'm talking about stepping into conversations where appropriate.
Yeah, we're thinking about those moments where there's unequal power in children's play, isn't there? And I think that's particularly salient in the context of Black and minoritized children, also children with dual ethnicity, mixed racial backgrounds. I know that was the focus of your doctoral research, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. Yeah, it was the focus of my doctoral research, because what I was looking at is the perspectives that children draw on around their mixed identity, not the ONS, the categorizations that are ascribed between Black, white and mixed. And even if you break down those categorizations of mixed is still talking to a narrative of white, Caribbean, white, African, and then other. And what does the other mean for a child that's learning about themselves? And I draw on perspectives of my own lived experience, where my children are Spanish and I'm of Jamaican heritage, although born here and brought up here. But again, particularly where language is concerned and the use of language for children from a mixed ethnic background, their perspectives are key, because they will use a different language, and it's probably a language that was shared at home to try and support children to have an understanding around maybe why their skin colour is so different or similar to others. And that's what my research did, working with those children. And the narratives that they share are so important, because they don't align with anything that we as adults would talk to, really. And they're really clever at looking at paints and clearly telling a practitioner these paints are not the right colour. So again, when you're having activities that explore identity, and being able to have these conversations are really good.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think particularly for children with mixed ethnicity, perhaps a little bit less research within that area to kind of grasp the complexity of those children understanding both parts of their identities in the early years. Did your findings speak to that and how practitioners might be able to enable their voice to come through in terms of their identity?
It really did speak to that. That's completely, thank you, Shaddai, what my PhD is on, about the mixed ethnic child and the contributions that they can offer to our ways of understanding. And what makes my research unique is that it reports on their narratives. So it's not the narrative of the adult. There's a whole chapter that speaks to the narratives of the children. And what they're doing is switching between these identities, and they do it very adeptly. So yes, when I consult or I teach around this topic, the message is very clear that you must speak to both identities, because you don't want to invalidate one, you don't want to inadvertently eliminate one part of the identity. Both parts are equally important, because children will speak to that. So for example, a mixed child will talk to I'm a whitish colour. Others may speak to I'm a light brown colour. So they're talking in terms of skin colour. That's what they're seeing, and that's their way of knowing and navigating the world. But it's about embracing both parts of that identity, because the findings showed and the parents shared, and this was a white parent, that he felt his child would have to ascribe to notions of black and blackness, which for a white father, for me, it felt deeply distressing that we still operate in those ways, and that his identity would almost be removed. And it was causing a real complexity for the child in the home environment, yet not being explored in the setting, which is really interesting. And what happened for that child is, there are other developmental impacts, because that child developed a stammer, and the stammer was coming from the distress around his race identity. So practitioners need to have an understanding that the impacts can be very significant. And this, a highly intelligent child, but we really do need to have a depth of understanding of embracing both parts of the identity and celebrating both parts of the identity as well, so that child can foster and navigate and move through life. And the research shows it, the levels of mental health in adolescent young men is quite significant around identity, which cries more for an importance of getting it right in early childhood. So, I've gone full circle, haven't I, Shaddai, where I go back to this strong sense of self, which is why it is so important to explore the curious nature of children's ideas around identity and being brave. I've spoke to practitioners about being brave to do that. I just think it gives a real, if you were to think about something that you did at the end of the day and you went home and you're absolutely exhausted, working with young children is exhausting. But if you go home and you think, oh, look at what we discussed today and look at what we celebrated today, that to me, I'm sorry for those out there that are wedded to literacy, numeracy and science, but for me, fostering children's sense of self is the precursor for learning about those important contexts.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think people will always remember how you make them feel and in terms of their identity rather than what you teach them or what they learn. And that for me is just as important in that personal development and growth as human beings, really.
Absolutely.
I have read your PhD and I think it's really insightful, and I'd recommend that to listeners if they're interested in finding out a little bit more. Just back on that point around practitioners and the need to promote children's identities, in what ways can they do that go beyond tokenism?
Oh, going beyond tokenism is so important, isn't it? I think the starting point, Shaddai, is reflection. There's a real need to reflect on self, and it's developing a reflexive pedagogy. So a lot of my research talks to participation and participatory approaches, but it's about re-examining your own practice. Practice becomes very normalized very quickly because it's driven by routine. So it almost becomes that you don't need to think about what's going to happen in the day for the children. We're going to do this activity, we're going to have this experience. But for me, it's thinking about the approaches that may need adapting to meet the diverse needs of the children. Yeah. And then in that reflection, knowing that once you know the children, and by that I mean the ethnic and cultural context of the children, the groupings that you're working with on a day-to-day basis, it's identifying and considering the gaps in your knowledge about the issues that directly impact on those children and their families, of course. Yeah. So that's where this idea of inclusion and equality and equity becomes very clear for me. To be able to drive an equitable curriculum framework, the practitioner needs to address their own knowledge so that they don't inadvertently discriminate and they don't limit the experiences or the ways in which those children understand. So this is where we're talking about the unique child, aren't we? So in my research, I talk about the individual unique needs of the child. But I think before all of that, once that knowledge is developing, and we said, didn't we, that it's not an end. You know, you don't think, oh, I know all about the children, tick. For me, what is absolutely key that practitioners can do is develop a trusting relationship. And it's this idea of supporting children to co-regulate, moving beyond self-regulation. So we have talked about behaviour. So the idea is that through and I'd drawn Mine Chonkabaya's work here for supporting children with co-regulation. That's the important role of the practitioner, so that they can talk to children through open-ended questioning. That's a technique that most practitioners are highly skilled at. I love observing what do you think? And how could those wonderful open-ended rather than closed discussions that allow the children to explore. You won't have exact answers, but you're both on the process of learning. Those are some of the things that I think practitioners, that's the starting point of what they can do.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Sharon. They seem like some really, really important points to ensure that listening to the child is embedded over a long period and done in a meaningful way. I think what you're saying about co-regulation and just listening for me feels really, really valuable. One final way I'm thinking about is the importance of documentation. I'm reflecting the child's voice within the setting, and that broader ongoing process of ensuring that the child's voice is heard and listened to and that they feel heard within their practice. I think documentation can really support practitioners within their practice to do that.
Yes, I do. I think absolutely, because you've got an ongoing record, haven't you, through that documentation. And I know we talked to this idea of next steps, but through documentation, it allows for that, again, that reflection for the practitioner to then check. I talk about member checking. We talk about that in research, don't we? But it's about checking and then noticing so that then you can respond. So I talk to a narrative around, if it's about time, it's as long as it takes. This isn't around reaching a goal by the end of the reception year. This is about an ongoing journey that should be able to be passed on through documentation. I wish there were sections that are talking about the identity so that future educators have that understanding of the children that will be entering into their classroom, and then understanding the nuanced ways in which they may need to adapt that learning for that child. Because for me, it's about It's about the relationship. It's then about the patience, being really patient. I understand that practitioners are working in very pressurised environments, but there's a need for patience with inclusion for me. Just as you would have that patience for a child with additional needs, you therefore need it for a child that's coming from a diverse background that may have a different way of learning or operating, should we say, within the classroom. And then being less hurried. I love Professor Alison Clark's work about the less hurried child, because children now are pushing back against, and they do it in very nuanced ways, because children are clever. So as much as we want to be hurried as adults, children need to be unhurried in their play. So yeah, again, this affordance of time, as long as it takes.
Yeah, absolutely. Taking time to really reflect on how to promote the child's voice in a meaningful sense feels really, really fundamental. There's lots of important guidance there for listeners to go away and reflect on, to consider how they might promote the child's voice towards inclusive practice in a broader sense. It's a great place to end it there. Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you, Shaddai.
I would like to say a huge thank you to our guest Sharon for joining us and providing such valuable insights. You've been listening to TTS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Shaddai Tembo, and Sharon Colilles. If you have been inspired by our conversation today, don't forget you can sign up via the link in our episode notes to be the first to hear about future episodes and access exclusive follow-up content, including ideas for your setting and links to relevant resources.